I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Jarrad Hope, founder of Logos Network and Status, who's opening up our privacy track. Jarrad Hope.
Cool. Thank you. Do I have a clicker? Ah. Hi, I'm Jarrad. I'm going to be talking about corruption, KYC, and the cost of compliance. This is a talk I just finished last night, so apologies for any mishaps or any pacing issues. So September the 10th, 2001, pay attention to that date, Donald Rumsfeld held a press conference where he stated, according to some estimates, we cannot track $2.3 trillion in transactions. He went on to say that the adversary, in his mind, was closer to home. It was the Pentagon bureaucracy. The following year, Jim Minery basically traveled the entire continent of the US, trying to track down $300 million worth of unaccounted adjustments. Unfortunately, he couldn't find how it was spent at all, right? He went on to say that we know it's gone, but we don't know what they spent it on. In 2015, I think, Catherine Austin Fitts released a report showing that the Department of Housing and Urban Development, as well as the Pentagon, had $6.5 trillion of unsupported adjustments. This was 54 times the amount of spend authorized by Congress, right? Which was $122 billion for the year. Now, Mark Skidmore thought that she made a mistake, right? Well, surely it's not in the trillions, it's probably more like 6.5 billion. So they got together and they mapped out the undocumented or unsupported unaccounted adjustments for the period of 1998 to 2015. They found a whopping $21 trillion that had been spent that nobody knows what it had been spent on, right? Like, this isn't just the normal budget, this is just money that's disappeared, right? That works out to be an average of like $1.2 trillion a year, in which we have no idea where that money went. Now, this is, of course, old news for the military whistleblower Frank Spinney, who came out in, I think it was 1983, and he's on record saying the books have been cooked routinely year after year. It's also, just last year, this year, that's right, Senator Chuck Grassley, in talking about some of the misspending during COVID, has said when it comes to catching fraud, the Department of Defense internal controls are a complete failure. We've known it for decades, right? Chuck Grassley is actually quite famous for finding a whole bunch of misspends, let's say, such as $43 million spent on a gas station in Afghanistan, which was supposed to cost $500,000. He's found soap at $117. He's found hammers that were $400. Pliers, $1,000. These are all each. Forks and spoons, $57 each. And toilet seat lids, which have gone from $640 to more recently $10,000 in the Air Force, right? This is just toilet seat lids. There's nothing special about them. The money's, just the way the procurement worked this way. And he's quite grumpy about it, as you can see. So how does this happen, right? Like, where is this money coming from? Well, it turns out the Department of Defense has one of the oldest computer programs running that's still in active use. It came out in, I think, the 1958, right? This is called MOCUS, Mechanization of Contract Administration Services. And what this does is routinely and algorithmically find old money from abandoned or other government programs. Now, normally this would be completely illegal for any other government agency to do that, but here we are. It's also written in COBOL, which is kind of cool. So to give you a sense of proportion of what we're talking about here, here's the 1.2 trillion annual unsupported adjustments that we have no idea what that money is, right? Adjusted for inflation today, it's probably closer to $2.4 trillion. Now let's compare that to global illicit financial flows, right? Two estimates are here. One is from the United Nations, which shows they believe that roughly 2 to 5% of global GDP is caught up in illicit financial flows. That would be a lower bound of $1.6 trillion and an upper bound of roughly $4 trillion for a year. NASDAQ Global Financial Crime report came out in recently this year, and for their estimates of 2023, they put it around roughly $3.1 trillion. Now, the day after Donald's press conference, where he announced the Pentagon bureaucracy being an adversary, 9/11 happened, right? And this basically spurred, this event spurred all of the compliance issues that we face today. Within a month, the Financial Action Task Force released 8 of the 9 special recommendations towards terrorism financing. Obviously, the Patriot Act moved forward as well as a result of this event and contains roughly 4 sections explicitly for KYC and AML. So 311 is for the authority for the Secretary of Treasury to target unspent, specifically for money laundering and terrorist financing. Section 326 basically establishes a minimum set of standards for financial institutions. So this includes all the things that you're familiar with, right? Like verification of identity, maintenance of records, things like it has to have their name, their address, and other relevant data like your photo and so on, right? Section 351 basically is about immunity for suspicious activity reports, right? So if you, if you tattletale on somebody, it's fine. And 352 is essentially instructions for financial institutions to implement all of these anti-money laundering programs. Now, this event and the Patriot Act in particular is what forced the entire globe to implement the compliance that we have today around KYC and AML. Here is a survey from 2015, the true cost of anti-money laundering compliance from LexisNexis, where the Asian banks in this survey said that US regulation embodied by the Patriot Act was most frequently overall the reason for implementing these rules. So going back to this, this sense of proportion, right? So we can see basically government fraud on one side, we can see illicit financial flows on the other side. When we're talking about KYC and AML, we're largely talking about illicit financial flows. But the justification was largely through terrorism, right? Let's have a little zoom in to see exactly how much that is economically, just to give you a sense of proportion of what we're talking about here. You see it yet? How about now? There we go. So in our latest estimates of terrorism financing, NASDAQ believes that this is roughly 11.5 billion global, right? Looks quite small there, and it is. So I thought, well, surely, like maybe we've solved terrorism. Like, it's no longer an issue, right? But actually, if you dial back throughout history, in 2001, the World Bank and IMF basically found that the global flow of funds to terrorist organizations was between $300 million and $500 million. In 2005, RAND estimated Al-Qaeda's budget was roughly between $30 to $50 million. In 2015, Department of Treasury estimated ISIS had $1 billion in annual revenue, and Europol in 2016 believed it got to around $2 billion, right? So like they're huge sums, like don't get me wrong, and it's obviously an important problem, but there's like a sense of proportion here that's just completely out of scale compared to the rest of what we have. And to kind of drive that point home, the Stimson Study Group, in their report on counterterrorism spending, found that between 2002 and 2017, the total spend on counterterrorism was $2.8 trillion, or $186 billion average per year, right? This is 16 times the amount of money that is going towards terrorism financing. And the other thing we'll get to later is around like the actual cost of compliance. And when it comes to just US banks alone, the cost of compliance are almost double what we're seeing in just terrorism financing, roughly like $22 billion annually. But you know, there is this other illicit financial flows thing. It's huge. Clearly, it's important, right? One of the issues with illicit financial flows is there is no consensus on what even a definition of it is, right? So there is no single agreed upon definition, but it generally comprises of tax evasion, multinational tax avoidance, the theft of state assets, and the laundering of proceeds from crime. And a bunch of other sort of humanitarian things around like drug smuggling and human trafficking, and of course, corruption. Addressing them is important. So in a research handbook on money laundering, it was found that you know, money that basically gets taken by crime gets reinvested by crime and therefore creates more crime. And in a book called Prioritizing Development, which basically tries to took the top economists to dollar for dollar rank all of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And they found it to be one of the top priorities. But the reason why it's important, as far as I can understand, is that IFFs of all types are essentially associated with ineffective state functioning, illegitimate use of state power, and international problems between economies or states, right? It's essentially lost GDP equals lost tax revenue, which means you get poor governance, is the argument. So what exactly are IFFs? Well, that also depends. Like definitions, there isn't really a set methodology or even real hard data on understanding what illicit financial flows are. This is 2 decades after this whole thing really started off. There's a few estimates here that you can show that I'm just showing here, just to basically give you an idea. So NASDAQ's report basically puts 25% towards drug trafficking, 12% towards human trafficking, and 63% into other, which can be organized crime, fraud, and corruption. Both Cardamone and Carr find that 80% is towards trade misinvoicing, and Raymond Baker views this as roughly 65% trade misinvoicing. Trade misinvoicing is is particularly prevalent when it comes to developing countries. Multinationals will go to them and say that a certain amount of ore was extracted for a certain price and then sell it at very different prices. So you can hide money through these cross-national transactions doing this. So Peter Reuter basically traces the issue of illicit financial flows back to Raymond Baker in his book, Capitalism Achilles' Heels. And it's quite interesting because his company, Global Financial Integrity, basically set the dominant methodology for years. And the issue with this is that there's actually no empirical basis for it. It's all prescience, and there's no means to actually assess it either. Worse, the Financial Action Task Force's own report and document on how to comply, the FTF methodology for assessing compliance with the FTF recommendations and the effectiveness of AML CFT systems, also lacks hard data, right? They have general crime statistics that they refer to, anecdotal evidence to basically try and collect, and subjective conclusions. In this report, basically, it's just another quote saying there are different measures and models for, in this case, estimating money laundering, but there is actually no globally accepted model, right? It really depends. And it's not necessarily the fault of the people who are trying to do this. Like, one of the major components of IFFs is financial secrecy. And so if these things are hidden, how are you supposed to determine what they are? But to the United Nations' credit, there is a pilot that's currently ongoing. It has not finished. They're predominantly focused on trying to create much more reputable data around drug trafficking, particularly in developing countries. And things like Mexico and Colombia, where there are that sort of industry. So we have a bit of vaguity around definitions, around the methodology. We don't really even know what they are. We have some general ideas. That kind of already leads into like whether they're effective or not. Not really, because you can't measure them. But it's really bad, right? By the Financial Action Task Force own admission of 2023, less than 1% of global illicit financial flows was recovered, right? Ronald F. Paul finds that less than 0.1% impact of criminal finances, and the UN basically finds 0.2% of illicit funds are intercepted, right? In other words, 99.9% of criminal proceeds are unaffected, even with all the compliance that we've implemented today. So what can we measure? Well, we can measure the direct cost to banks, as I mentioned before. LexisNexis, in the same survey, basically found that the cost to US banks alone, right? We're not talking about all banks on the planet, just the US, is $26.4 billion annually. This is more than double the entire financing to terrorism, right? Ronald F. Paul goes on to say the compliance costs exceed recovered funds more than 100 times over. And banks, taxpayers, and ordinary citizens are penalized more than criminal enterprises. And I'm sure if you've tried to do any trading or anything like that, you've probably felt a little bit of this. These challenges and unintended consequences of financial regulation have been highlighted at the OECD and the B20 for several years. In fact, when it comes to traditional trade finance, 50 to 60%, more than half the price is charged to clients for trade is basically used to cover operational expenses, in which compliance is a major component of. The problem with this is it starts to lock out and exclude, especially in developing countries, like small enterprises. Now, the reason this is important is this notion of transaction costs, right? So the Copenhagen Consensus has this great paper where they show that if you can do a 0.01% reduction in transaction costs, then you can enable a country to quadruple its wealth. This is the difference between Argentina and Switzerland, right? So what would be probably better is to, I'll get into that, maybe. But to focus on like institutional efficiency, right? If we can actually make things more efficient, we can actually generate more, unlock more wealth or capability from the existing society, rather than having this sort of scarcity, sort of surveillance mindset, where we've sold out our civil liberties. And Michael Levy goes on to say that no one could rationally think that AML controls in general, or in financial investigation in particular, will solve organized crime, right? It's just not going to happen through this, unless there's like radical step towards transparency at the highest levels, right? Now, it doesn't get better. So Amnesty International accused India of weaponizing the Financial Action Task Force recommendations. They've been doing so, according to Amnesty International, since 2010, and they basically target civil society, like dissidents, journalists, academics, human rights activists, and even students are using these laws. In fact, the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI, which is a UK think tank, it's been around for ages, very reputable, has also created a report that documents these kinds of abuses. In their case, they're largely focusing on authoritarian regimes, but as we've seen, whether we call India an authoritarian regime is probably up for debate. But they do outline, I definitely recommend reading it, but they outline a bunch of tactics that are used for this weaponization, right? So they basically do phishing and scraping, strategic bank account freezing, harassment and prosecution of organizations, pre-trial detentions, and basically just general lawfare for transnational repression. And like, one of the issues with this is because of the recommendations that are put out by the Financial Action Task Force, law gets rushed through Parliament really quickly. And because it gets rushed through quickly, because if you don't get it through, you're economically locked out by the member states. So that means the wording and the care that goes into that law doesn't happen, which means that it can be abused in the future. And this is what's going on right now. Now, this is basically a preamble to what Alex Cobham identifies, that illicit financial flows are likely by and large to be an elite phenomenon, right? That's not you or me, it's people who are actually in power and in control, who actually have the resources to benefit from this kind of arbitrage, let's put. You're all here, so you're probably aware that Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Chase last year, basically said crypto was a tool for criminals, drug traffickers, money laundering, and tax avoidance. And if he was the government, he would try and shut crypto down, right? The irony is that he was basically fined a few weeks later for $348 million for inadequate trade reporting, and this was then followed by another 80 regulatory fines for banking violations going back to 2003, which was a total amount paid of $39 billion, right? Of course, JP Chase is not unique in this. There was the FinCEN files, which basically showed that pretty much all major banks were doing some dodgy stuff, more than some, and participating in this and enabling it, right? The fines that were handing out for the amounts that they were allowing it's quite alarming, right? Like, I mean, if you're actually serious about clamping down on this and implementing this kind of compliance, yeah. Which brings us to the Financial Secrecy Index, right? I want to point out here that the United States is by and large like the largest harbor of illicit financial flows. They dwarf Switzerland and Singapore, which coming up second and third, right? I think it's roughly, according to FSI, the global scale weight here is roughly 25%, and Switzerland comes down to roughly just under 4%, right? So Peter Roeder basically says, asking a kleptocratic state to create an effective AML system is like asking a fox to create a better henhouse, right? It is the governing political elite that benefits most substantially from the weaknesses of the existing system of controls. Again, this is not a problem of us as citizens. This is a problem of our elites. In fact, Bloomberg put this chart out, showing that trust in most US institutions have basically withered away. The thing is that this is not just specific to the United States. This is also happening globally. So the Office for National Statistics in 2022 found that the UK population, only 35% trust the national government. France has reached a new historic low where 82% of the citizens don't believe it's going in the right direction. And on a global scale, according to the OECD, the average public trust in governments is hovering around 41%, but has been declining. So according to Transparency International's 2023 Corruptions Perception Index, over 2/3 of countries score below 50 out of 100. On their index, roughly, the average is 43. And more alarming is that 23 countries have fallen to their lowest scores to date this year, Now, why is this important? Well, there's a great report called The Whereas the Wealthiest Nations in 2006 by the World Bank, where they basically find that human capital and the value of institutions, by and large, is the largest share of wealth in virtually every country. It's even more so than natural resource extraction by their estimates, right? And this is basically to say that I hope from this talk, I don't have any solutions, I'm afraid. Obviously, it's a very complex problem. Illicit financial flows are important to tackle, but follow the money methods like KYC and AML just aren't working, right? We see that the costs are enormous. What is recovered isn't there. But there are a lot of sort of low-hanging fruit when it comes to institutions, such as the Pentagon, where you could save enormous amounts of money for a nation or a society and ultimately lead it to high-quality wealth output for that country. And yeah, that's basically it. Thank you.
I read somewhere that the city of London is approximately 7 years away from compliance costs eating all potential profits.
Yeah, right.
And you think about that, that's like really crazy. And we seem to be going even in a deeper direction. You know, really, it's like the shit's really flowing downhill. Yeah.
I haven't even talked about the debt to GDP ratios of all OECD countries, right? There's a great quote which I wanted to include, where basically every developed country.
You want to call it back?
No, I don't have the slide.
Okay.
I thought I ran out of time, too many slides. But yeah, like within 25 years, almost every developed country and developing country is going to be having to severely restructure their debt or their toast, you know.
Jubilee, basically.
Yeah.
At some point. My question: you've delved quite deep into the topic that most of us just sort of like talk about on the surface or pass information on. And from the philosophical standpoint, why do you think this is happening?
I don't know if I feel really comfortable like saying why I think it really is happening. But I mean, in a similar way that like 9/11 had ushered in like a new era of surveillance capitalism, I mean, this is just an extension of it. It's just on the economic domain, right? And it's great to have control for the people who are in power, I guess.
Do you really? So I don't know. I have a gut feeling that it's sort of like a titanic, inertial force that's happening. It's like a systemic thing that's happening. I find it, so there's all these individual decisions that are happening that just sort of inch in this direction, and it seems that the inertia is even forcing the decision makers.
I don't believe that at all.
Okay.
No, I think like in one of my other talks, I was talking about like elite theory, right? And like there's a very clear actor that had pushed this onto every financial institution around the planet at the same time, right? Like, now, whether or not the justification of terrorism, as they see it, whether they genuinely believe that or not, we can only speculate, right? So, like, maybe you could view the unintended consequences of losing civil liberties over the past 2 decades is unintended, but maybe it's very intentional.
Do we have any questions?
Thanks for the talk. This is really interesting. So you talked a little bit about the limited data that's available indicating the very low rate of interception of illicit funds.
Yeah.
One argument that I've heard, I guess, in favor of the current kind of overbearing AML regime would be one of deterrence, where even though interception rates might be low, perhaps just knowledge of this overbearing AML regime could perhaps, deter further illicit funds. Is there any data to either support or negate this?
I wouldn't know about that specifically, but like generally speaking, I think that there is not really any data one way or the other. On deterrence, I can definitely see that being applied to like the general population. Like, you know, that's generally how like regulation works in some ways, right? Is like you're kind of betting on some kind of cooling effect or disincentivizing people from doing that. I think like what I'm trying to say here though is that kind of deterrence doesn't happen to the people who are actually doing these things because they are also the ones that are implementing them, right? So the deterrence applies to us, not so much to the people who have, you know, putting billions of dollars into the Cayman Islands or whatever.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Kind of a bit of a follow-up on the last question. A lot of this started with the Bank Secrecy Act in the United States in 1970, and the threshold amount that was used at the time was $10,000 US. And today, the threshold amount that's been talked about around the world is also $10,000 US, euros, etc., roughly in that range. This is a case of using inflation to simply slowly squeeze everything else down.
Yep.
And I'm saying, as the most saleable alternative, drastically increase those limits. So instead of having $10,000 US, you have $1 million US. And you say, well, look, you know, we can catch the big guys, and you can get your dirty money that way, but let's forget trying to catch every cup of coffee. Any thoughts on that approach?
Not really. I don't have any like major thoughts on that, but it's super fascinating. Yeah.
Yes, you can maybe hash it out together.
Yeah.
On the podcast, or
I would love that actually. Yeah.
yeah, I think you would be great on Logos podcast. Yeah. Jarrad Hope, always a pleasure for keeping us thinking and keeping us informed.
Thank you.